This is an Intro to Logic video. In this video, we'll be going over how to write a logical proof. The main terms that we'll be covering are sequence and scope line. A sequent is a shorthand for writing logic problems. So for example, here we have a sequent, and we're going to write sequence as follows. There will be a bracket in the middle which separates the assumptions on the left-hand side from the conclusion you are trying to derive on the right-hand side. So here we have an argument, and if you're asked to solve this argument, what you'll need to do is draw your scope line, write your assumed premises, which are on the left-hand side of the bracket. So our first one is the sentence P. Our second assumed premise is if P, then Q. And so we're writing A's for assumption. And now we know that we want to find Q. That is our goal. That's the conclusion that we need to derive. Now this is a very short argument, as we've seen several times. It's simply just a modus ponens argument. So all we have to do is use lines 1 and 2 and the rule of inference MP, or modus ponens, and we can derive Q, the consequent of the conditional on line 2. So that's what a sequent is, and this is how we will write sequence in the future. Okay, now that we know how to write sequence, let's practice writing logical proofs. Here's 4 easy steps that you can always follow when writing a logical proof. And I'm going to use the following sequent for practice. So recall that on the left-hand side of the bracket is going to be our assumed premises. So we have 3 assumed premises in this case. And on the right-hand side of the bracket is the conclusion that we're trying to derive. So let's write the logical proof. According to our rules over here, the first thing that we need to do is draw a scope line. So I will just draw a line as follows. Check. The next thing you do is number and write the assumed premises in symbolic form. And note that the numbers go on the left-hand side of the scope line, and the premises, or the sentence letters, go on the right-hand side of the scope line. So we have 3 assumed premises. The first one we can write as if R, then S. And we'll write A for assumption. Our next one is if S, then P. Also write A for assumption. And our last assumption is just R. Now note that you could write these in any order. If you wanted to start with R, then if S, then P, then if R, then S, that's totally fine. If you want to start with if S, then P, and so on, that's fine. The order that you write the premises in really doesn't matter. What matters is that every step you take in your argument is a proper use of the rules of inference. So that's really what you need to make sure that you're doing properly. It's okay if your assumptions are jumbled or not exactly identical to the way I've written here. What you need to make sure you do is always use rules of inference correctly. So we've done step 2. Great. The next step is to write the conclusion at the bottom of the scope line. Now this step is not required, but I highly recommend it because it can be very useful when you go on to do longer and harder proofs. So our conclusion is on the right-hand side of that bracket. It's the P. So we can just estimate how many steps you think you're going to have to take. You'll get better at that as you progress. And then just write the conclusion at the bottom. So P. Now one of the great things about writing the conclusion is this allows you to work backwards. So if you ever get stuck or you have a really long problem, you could always start by asking yourself, how could I get to P? Where in these assumptions is the sentence P? And that might be a good starting point for figuring out how you're going to derive that conclusion. So notice we only have P in line 2, which means we're going to have to find S somehow to take out the P, which is only in line 1, which means we need to find R, which is in line 3. So that's one way to work backwards when doing this problem. Alright, so we've done step 3. And now step 4. Write the rules of inference on the right-hand side of the scope line. And of course, always write any lines that you use when using rules of inference. So, let's see what we have to do here. We can use lines 3 and 1 to derive S. So maybe stop and ask yourself, well, what rule would you have to use to derive s from lines 1 and 3? And the answer is modus ponens, right? Modus ponens says that if we have a conditional and the antecedent of that conditional, which we do here, you can derive the consequent. And so that's how we get s by itself. All right, so now we want to ask ourselves, is there anything we can do with s now that we've derived that on a line all by itself? And if you stop and ask yourself, and you look at our available premises up here, the answer is yes. We can use lines 2 and 4 to derive p all by itself. So we'd write 2, 4, and ask yourself, what rule did you use to derive p? Modus ponens. So we've just repeated modus ponens, and now we have p, the conclusion that we were aiming for. So we have completed step 4, write the rules of inference on the right-hand side of the scope line. And of course, always write the lines that you use with those rules of inference if necessary. Note that assumption doesn't require any lines to be listed, because when you make an assumption, you're not really appealing to any other premise that existed earlier in the proof. You're just assuming some premise to be true. And that is how we write a logical proof. So I recommend using these steps when writing your own proofs, and just be sure to keep practicing. At this point, you may be wondering, why worry about scope lines at all? The simple answer is that scope lines help us keep our arguments very clear and easy to follow. And as we come across harder and longer problems, we're going to find that you can have several scope lines in a single argument. So right now we're seeing these baby arguments where we have just a few lines, a single scope line, and all looks great. But down the road, we're going to come across really long arguments where you may see some initial assumptions, and then you're going to have another scope line with some other stuff in here, and then maybe another scope line, and so on. So scope lines are going to help us keep clear the different steps we take in our argument. Consequently, it's very important that you do remember to use a scope line even when we're just starting out with these baby arguments, because having the habit is going to really help you in the end. One more reminder, keep in mind that each line in a proof is either A, a conclusion derived from other premises, or B, an assumption. So the only way to get a new premise or a new line in a proof is to either derive that line from earlier lines in the proof or to assume it. And those are the only ways to get a new line in a proof. In this video, you've been introduced to sequence and scope lines. This is an Intro to Logic video on how to write a logical proof. We'll see you next time. Be sure to check out our other videos at introtologic.com.